All right, hey guys. The next lecture is going to be, or this lecture is going to be on Renaissance literature. This is Renaissance writing, and we're going to talk about poets and authors and what have you. Much like the artists of the time period, Renaissance literary artists or writers rediscovered old Greco Roman stories and styles. Many of these were in Greek and Latin. They were later translated into Italian or into French or later into English as well. So, again, Renaissance literature is the rediscovery of old Greco Roman ideas, where the authors use logic and humanistic techniques to so-called modernize the story. Now remember, modern is 15th and 16th century. But many of these stories, especially those that were tackled by Shakespeare, were actually timeless ideas. About the lives of people. So they were the writings that are from the Renaissance were written in the local languages like Italian, French, English, and they had an advantage, of course, because they were spread on the printing press. So they're able to be mass produced. This is a new invention that comes in the 15th century. And allows for the mass production of books, whereas before this they had to be handwritten. And we're going to talk about three writers today. We'll talk about Petrarch, who is from Italy, Machiavelli, who's also from Italy, specifically from Florence, and then Shakespeare, who is not from Italy, actually from England, and we'll use him to illustrate the northern part of the Renaissance, this northern literature, northern Europe. So the first of these is Petrarch, and as you read about in your textbook, Petrarch is actually called the father of humanism. He rediscovered and then rewrote secular, non-religious, or especially non-Christian writings. He wrote or rewrote stories that came from the ancient world. They were pre-Christian. And even though they were pre-Christian, they had a moral, many of them had a moral relationship to them, a moral story, if you will. And he had rediscovered a Roman poet by the name of Cicero. Cicero, in the 1st century BCE, the 1st century before the Common Era, had written all about human affairs. He tried to tell the experiences of real people, and that's what Petrarch tried to do. Petrarch was living during a time period that if you had anything that was secular, non-religious, the church argued that that went against God. This was a way to help keep the people under control. And Petrarch argued that having secular thinking about the world, didn't necessarily mean that you didn't have a relationship with God, that you didn't believe in God. We believe that Petrarch himself was probably a devout Christian. However, his writing was definitely secular, definitely about humanity, and he tried to leave the religious side of it to the church. Well, Petrarch opened the door for others, particularly in northern Italy, the next of which was Niccolo Machiavelli. Machiavelli was a Florentine writer. He's from Florence, which means he worked for the Medici family. Machiavelli was a government official under the Medicis who was also a writer. He wrote many different types of writings, novels, plays. He actually tried to write a history of Florence, which is pretty good, pretty accurate. He wanted to dive into secular issues and tried to look at things objectively. Now, what does he mean that way? Well, objectivity, which is Machiavelli's idea. Tell me how things are, not how you wish they would be. Be truthful. And when dealing with people, be open. That certainly went against church teaching of the time period. Church teaching taught that when dealing with politics, said that when dealing with politics, rulers came from God. And Machiavelli went against that. Machiavelli wanted to be objective in his writing, wanted to be truthful in his writing, and he wanted to say, okay, rulers rule because why? That was the question. What is the most effective ruler? And that's what he tried to tackle. In 1513, Machiavelli published a book known as The Prince. It's one of the most famous pieces of literature, famous pieces of work to come out of the medieval period. It's actually a message to the Medici family. It's a book on how a ruler should treat his people. So think of the rulers that we have today, the president and the governor and what have you. It would be like me or someone else writing a book telling the ruler how to behave. And that if the ruler followed the directions, he or she would be successful. And that's what Machiavelli is trying to put out there. He said, listen, if you want to be successful among the people, you want to keep your job, then you need to do this, 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 and this. Well, that's what The Prince is all about. It's basically a list of things and that a prince should do and why he should do them. It's written with the idea that he believed it is better for a ruler to be feared than to be loved. He believed that if a ruler is loved, then the people will turn on him if they disagree. That leads to a ruler's downfall. But if a ruler is feared, if he is harsh, the people will never rise up against him. They will be afraid. He called for strong leadership and almost brutal leaders. Machiavelli believed, and he was probably right, that the vast majority of people were ignorant and unworthy of politics and political rights, that the vast majority of people should simply be led. He compared them to sheep. That were simply led around by a shepherd, not really having a mind of their own. That a government's job was to make sure that the people were orderly and stable. And that would keep a ruler in power. Not trying to be good to the people, but trying to make sure that the people behave. That was his ideas in The Prince. Now, it sounds pretty harsh to us, but many countries over the last 500 years, since The Prince was published, have looked back to this, and he's been the model for harsh rule for centuries. It's the idea that the people don't deserve the ruler because, quite frankly, they're too ignorant to understand him. And in many ways, Machiavelli wasn't just talking about the prince. He wasn't just talking about the Medici family. He was talking about rulers in general. So again, these part of the reason, excuse me one second. Sorry, I had to cough. So the pieces of literature, these works of literature by Petrarch, later by Machiavelli, and even later than that by Shakespeare, were printed on a new invention invented in the 1440s, right in the middle of the Renaissance, in Germany, called the printing press. It's invented by Johannes Gutenberg, a goldsmith from Germany. And this is in central Germany. And what he did was actually produce metal movable type that could be moved around so that you could have individual letters and symbols so that you could change them around. And you could put these together to form words. This allowed books and pamphlets to be mass produced. It was still much slower than what we have today, but a huge, huge deal. The Gutenberg press, so the Gutenberg press, or printing press, is considered by many to be the most important invention of the last 2,000 years. It allowed the mass production of books. It spread literacy. And allowed for the education of society. There's a lot of stuff that goes with that, obviously. Not just stuff about the Renaissance, but stuff about secular work, stuff about science, stuff about math, stuff about history. It can all be mass produced. And that was impossible before Gutenberg. Beforehand, before the 1440s, books were handwritten. It might take 6 months to produce a book, handwritten by a scribe. And it would be more like a work of art than a mass produced book. But that meant that literacy rates were very, very, very low. It was okay during the medieval period when nobody could read. But until the invention of the printing press, driving up literacy rates are going to be very difficult. But after the invention of the printing press, now even common people could get a hold of books. They weren't as rare as what they had been. And then finally, that leads us to our last literary figure of the Renaissance, probably the most famous, and that is William Shakespeare. Shakespeare was an English Renaissance playwright and author who rediscovered old Greco-Roman themes in literature and brought them into the modern age. It is his plays that are the most famous. He actually owned a theater in London called the Globe. And Shakespeare brought his plays to the masses, to average common people. He tried to spread Greco-Roman ideas directly through his plays. And they used modern characters from Shakespeare's time. But the stories behind those characters were timeless. And we're going to focus on Romeo and Juliet. Romeo and Juliet was all about a young couple. Boy meets girl. Boy and girl fall in love. Those ideas are timeless. Boy and girls, families, hate each other, but they love each other. Romeo's family hated Juliet's family, and then finally, boy and girl die because they can't be together. In the end, love is more important than life. That is the story of Romeo and Juliet. But it's also a timeless story that comes from the Greeks. This idea of all of this here is really just a Greek tragedy. Set to Shakespeare's time. In Shakespeare's time, as it is today, people can relate to this. People can relate to a young couple falling in love, but their families hating each other, and the young couple not knowing what to do. That's why the story is timeless. That's why it's still read today. And that's what Shakespeare was able to do. Take that timeless story and bring it to the people, the masses. Give it back to humanity. And that's Shakespeare's writing is all about. All of his stories are that way. Romeo and Juliet, Hamlet, Julius Caesar, Othello. They have timeless ideas, timeless stories, with so-called modern characters. Now again, modern to his age, but the stories themselves are what's timeless. Well, that concludes the lecture on Renaissance literature. Again, very much like Renaissance art, Renaissance literature is writings that brought back Greco-Roman ideas and put them before the mass of people. And a lot of it was done because of the printing press. That spread the word. All right, I hope you took good notes and be ready for a quiz on this stuff. Thanks, guys.